and move into the horseshoe when seats become available. Members can only speak from where there are microphones. Members who are not on the call list but wish to intervene can only do so from the horseshoe, and I remind members that those on the call list have priority for spaces on the horseshoe. Those wishing to intervene should not prevent a member on the call list from speaking. Order, order. Kate Osborne to move the motion.
I beg to move that this House has considered peace and human rights in Colombia. Thank you, Mrs Miller. It's an honour to serve under your chairmanship today and to lead this important debate. The human rights situation in Colombia is out of control. State violence in Colombia is out of control. The 2016 peace agreement has mechanisms to address these issues, but it has not been implemented anywhere close to the levels that it should have. The Colombian government is refusing to recognise the scale of the problem, instead seeking to present a squeaky clean image internationally whilst innocent civilians are being murdered. And let's be clear, recent events in Colombia have been condemned internationally by governments, the UN, the OAS and politicians from parliaments across the world. It is essential that our own government here in the UK does everything it can to hold the Colombian government to account. We cannot support trade deals and training programmes for the Colombian police without also condemning the state violence, and we need to increase our practical support for the peace process. I have visited Colombia on 2 occasions, in 2013 and more recently in 2018, on delegations to review the human rights situation and the implementation of the peace agreement. On those visits, I met with a wide range of stakeholders. What I heard then and what I see now is incredibly worrying, and I know that there are many of us in this House who follow closely the situation in Colombia, and we need to keep doing all we can to improve the human rights situation and to make sure the hope that was given to so many with the peace agreement is not destroyed. The timing of this debate is pertinent with the recent protests and horrifying police repression of the protesters. Earlier this year, millions of Colombians took to the streets, but the response of the Colombian police was to treat the protesters, who were from all sectors of Colombian society, as if they were an enemy to be defeated. The police responded to the protests as if they were at war. The images and videos have been horrifying. Between the 28th of April and the 26th of June, Colombian human rights organisations documented between 26 and 44 protesters likely to have been killed by the police. There were 28 cases of sexual assault reported, 257 cases of violence against journalists covering the protests, including over 100 physical assaults. The UN documented 56 people killed during the protests, 54 civilians and 2 members of the police. There were numerous incidents and videos which have showed the close collaboration of armed civilians or parastate actors and the Colombian police. Something that has been highlighted for decades but repeatedly denied by supporters and defenders of the Colombian political elite. Most notably in Cali on the 10th of May and 28th of May, where armed civilians came onto the street to shoot at protesters while standing alongside members of the police. The response of the Colombian president to these incidents was to tell the protesters to go home, whilst at the same time remaining silent regarding the apparent paramilitaries and the police operating side by side. I hope the Minister is able to tell me what steps the UK government is taking to review its training of Colombian police to ensure it is not supporting units or personnel who have been involved in cases of human rights abuses during the protests. The response of the Colombian government to the protests and the violence of the police only highlighted further that this is a government more determined to stigmatise protesters than ensure their protection. As protesters were being killed, the Defence Minister and the Vice President made statements trying to link protesters to criminal organisations, whilst the Justice Minister unbelievably tried to claim the protests formed part of an international criminal conspiracy to tarnish the image of Colombia. These slurs are unacceptable and we must unreservedly condemn them. I give my full support to all those protesting peacefully in Colombia, and I will do whatever I can to defend their right to protest. I hope everyone in this session today will give their full support to this sentiment. I welcome the investigations that have been opened into the abuses committed by state agents over recent months, but this is not enough. The police are alleged to have killed 13 people during protests in 2020 and violently attacked protesters in 2019, but almost all of these cases have still seen no justice for the victims and their families. Will the Minister join me in fully condemning the violence against protesters and in calling for judicial and disciplinary processes for abuses both during these protests and in previous years? Colombia has long been one of the world's most dangerous countries to be a human rights activist. According to the UN, 133 people were killed in 2020, and it is still the most dangerous country in the world for trade unionists, with 22 killed last year. It was also the most dangerous country in the world for environmental defenders in 2019, with 64 killed and a further 44 were killed between the 20th of July 2020 and the 30th of April 2021. The British government have been signing environmental agreements with its Colombian counterparts, but we must ask what is being done to ensure there is protection for those on the front line. Now I want to turn my remarks on the calls for hope in Colombia. In 2016, the peace agreement was a historic moment that brought genuine optimism to many, particularly in the most impoverished regions of the country. While overall implementation has been slow and in some areas non-existent, there have also been important advances, and I want to congratulate everyone from all sides that have played a role. The advancement of the transitional justice system should be particularly celebrated, and I want to congratulate the unwavering commitment of the FARC to the peace process, both in terms of the former combatants trying to create new lives under enormous difficulty, as well as the former commanders who are fully engaged in the peace process by accepting responsibility for their roles in crimes committed during the war. Just last week, the Transitional Justice Courts issued its first accusations against a former general and 9 other members of the military for their role in the murder of civilians. It is essential that there is full engagement with this process from state actors who stand accused, and international support from the UK government for the transitional justice system is absolutely essential. I very much hope that the Colombian government will honour its numerous declarations of commitment to the peace process during its final 12 months in office. And I hope that the Minister here today will reiterate the government's support for the Transitional Justice Courts and for its recent steps to investigate crimes committed by both the FARC and the Colombian state. It is extremely worrying that FARC former combatants continue to be targeted. Over 270 have now been killed since the deal was signed. And in April of this year, 8 former combatants who were inside the peace process were killed in just 9 days. Their protection is an absolute priority, as is the advancement in the many areas of the agreement that have seemingly stalled, particularly the implementation of the rural development programmes and the illicit crop substitution programmes. The cocaine economy is often pointed to as the cause of the insecurity and violence in the countryside, yet of the 99,000 families signed up to the mutually agreed crop substitution programme, only 7% have actually received support for alternative crops. Without an alternative economic option, the coca growers have no way of surviving. The peace agreement is a comprehensive agreement, and we must do all we can to ensure all its chapters are fully implemented. I welcome the repeated statements of support for the peace process from the UK government over recent years, but I'm sure we all agree that this must be backed up with maximum presence and pressure wherever and whenever necessary. And as we approach 5 years of the peace agreement, I would like to finish by calling on the Minister to ensure we honour our role as penholder and take a lead in international efforts to support a full implementation of the Colombian peace agreement, which is undoubtedly the best hope we have to bring an end to the human rights crisis and see Colombia truly in peace. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered peace and human rights in Colombia. And before I call the first speaker, I just wanted everybody to know that I intend to move to front bench speeches at 4:13. So the maths dictate around 4 minutes each if everybody's going to get in, and perhaps you could bear that in mind to show courtesy to others. And I call our first speaker, John Trickett.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your guidance about the 4-minute limit, which I'll try my very best to adhere to. And can I congratulate my honourable friend for organising this debate and the House authorities for allowing it to take place too. Colombians are good-natured and democratic people, and they love liberty and life too. But they are experiencing a prolonged crisis whose roots lie deep in Colombian society, but above all in the current failing economic model. The economy is in free fall, and the government wanted to raise taxes on the hardest hit. And so social cohesion is breaking down as inequality accelerates in that wonderful country. Almost half of all Colombians now live in poverty, 15% in the most extreme poverty conditions. Meanwhile, the richest 10% in Colombia earn 2/5 of all of the country's incomes. And many Colombians, when you speak to them, will speak of endemic elite corruption and of the power of the cartels in the economy. So little surprise then that through the country, civilians in very large numbers have become increasingly active in fighting for justice. And of course, we express our solidarity, I'm sure from all parts of the House, with all those citizens fighting for a just settlement in Colombia or anywhere else in the world. But undoubtedly, wealthier Colombians and the international corporations which have become implanted there have felt threatened by this citizen activity. And so this very right-wing government, Colombian government, has done what such governments always do everywhere, which is to defend extreme privilege, wealth and power, even at the expense of their own people's freedoms and, sadly, at the expense, in some cases, of people's lives. The Colombian criminal justice system too often has been used as a government tool to attack human rights in an attempt to suppress this incipient citizen movement. We've heard the figures given by my honourable friend about the number of deaths, 5,000 cases of police violence, 44 police killings, 2,000 arbitrary arrests, 77 protesters who have been disappeared, and that's only in the last 3 or 4 months. As was said, the ITUC and Amnesty have declared that Colombia is the most dangerous place in the world to be a trade unionist fighting back, or to be an environmentalist. They might have added also to be an indigenous activist or LGBTQ rights activists. So let me turn then just finally to the involvement of the British government, because the UK's College of Policing has been training Colombian police officers. Our very own CPS provided criminal justice advisors, so-called. The British government spent £2.3 million training specialised cadres of police in Colombia. There are other programmes too lengthy to mention, but British policing is meant to be based on the principle of consent. So what on earth have we, the British, been doing, apparently in cahoots with a government which seems to have removed civil liberty and human rights from what ought to be their central role in their criminal justice system in Colombia? So let me turn finally, because I want to be very brief, to the Minister. The British government needs to come off the fence and be quite clear about this. There's no evidence that the situation in Colombia is improving. In fact, it's deteriorating. And therefore, there can be no justification in offering words of goodwill to effectively the President, who is a human rights abuser of the grandest scale. Minister, please condemn the abuse of civil rights in Colombia and ensure that all UK programmes henceforth either comply totally with democratic values or cease those programmes immediately. Thank you very much.
I should have pointed out, for the benefit of members, there has actually been a stopwatch put on the screen, just in case that's of assistance in the countdown. And we now move virtually to Tony Lloyd in Rochdale. Tony Lloyd.
And thank you, Mrs. Miller. And I'd say your point about the clock. I'm genuinely very grateful to my honourable friend Fajaro for both obtaining this debate and introducing it so skillfully, because what she's outlined, I think, really does matter. It matters for anybody who respects things like the right of peaceful protest, anybody who respects the most basic of human rights, because what's been going wrong in Colombia in recent months is shocking, even in a country that is used to shock. The demonstrations against government policies in sheer scale have been unprecedented over the many years that I've known Colombia. And yet those demonstrations have been overwhelmingly peaceful, and that's been acknowledged by the UN, by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and the EU. Even the Colombian government's accepted that overwhelmingly there were peaceful demonstrations. And yet that was met, as my friend Fajaro has said, with the defence minister calling these demonstrations a terrorist threat by criminal organisations. That is not simply ludicrous, it's dangerous. And it was dangerous because that has led to the death toll that my honourable friends have already talked about following these protests, the arbitrary arrests, the use of massive levels of violence by the Colombian police, which quite frankly have been out of control, including, as my friend Fajaro pointed out, 28 sexual assaults on people held in custody, including the very sad case of Alison Melendez, a 17-year-old who was raped by the police and then went home and committed suicide. Nothing can bring back Alison, nothing can undo that damage for her family. So it does matter, and it matters to those of us who care about Colombia, as we should. The peace accords in Colombia were a wonderful step forward, but as we've seen in terms of the use of violence by the police in relation to these demonstrations, we've also seen effectively a denial for those who gave up guerrilla warfare, members of the FARC, 278 of them murdered since the peace accords were signed, a lack of progress on land reform, a lack of progress on things like funding those who've given up the growing of coca leaf for manufacturing into cocaine. Those things are deliberate policies by the Colombian government, and being deliberate, they are sabotaging that peace effort. Now, like my honourable friend for Hemsworth, I must say to the Minister, I've seen condemnation from different sources. The United Nations Office of the Commission of Human Rights has condemned these levels of violence recently. Even in the United States, they've been called for restraint. Very little words from the British government ministers. And I think the minister has got to stand up and make it very clear that we do denounce the kind of violence we're seeing from the Colombian police and the Colombian military. And that does bring me on where I've got to share the view as well, that if we now do need to look at our relationship in terms of police reform, yes, of course, it's right and proper that we push for police reform, and that as penholder of the UN, the British government has a unique role in bringing forward verification missions to see that that takes place. But the big prize, Mrs. Miller, has got to be, I believe now, that we look at the capacity under the democratic clause in the UK Andean Pact, which makes it clear that human rights violations triggers certain consequences. I think it's about time our government looked at that human rights clause in that pact and considered whether now we've got to trigger it. Thank you, Mrs. Miller.
Patrick Grady.
Thank you, Mrs Miller. It's a pleasure to serve, and I congratulate as well the Honourable Member for Yarrow on securing the debate, the first we've had since 2019 in Westminster Hall, and very timely to have it before the recess and while the situation in Colombia, as we're hearing, is deteriorating so seriously. I think it's a bit unfortunate the Minister's all by herself on the Conservative benches. It would be nice to see some government backbenchers show an interest in this, and perhaps they might reflect on whether they have any activists or indeed expat Colombians in their constituencies whose voices should be heard. Some of those voices are communicated to us through organisations such as Justice for Colombia and AB Colombia and its partner organisations, SCIAF, CAFOD, Christian Aid and others. And I want to thank them for their support in helping us prepare for this belief. And for many years with SCIAF, I heard about Colombia, I've met people from Colombia, and then in 2018 I finally had the privilege of visiting the country. Such a lush, beautiful country, rich in its diversity of peoples as well as its natural resources, and rich in the potential to be a model of sustainable development and conflict resolution, but also at risk of the exact opposite, of backsliding from the progress that has been made, of falling into the hands of those who would exploit and strip the country of its bounty and oppress its people and destroy their cultures. And we're hearing about those in the debate today. The context the pandemic has caused, the tax rises to pay for economic support, leading to these dreadful outbreaks of violence. We've heard some of those statistics, the UNHCR reckoning at least 56 people, 54 civilians and 2 police officers killed up to the 16th of June. And in recent meetings by the APPG and Justice for Colombia, we've heard first-hand testimony from people caught up in that violence and elsewhere in the country. And it simply demonstrates what we've heard already, that it is one of the most dangerous countries in which to be a trade unionist or any kind of human rights actor or defender. And as the member for Hemsworth said, some of this is very deep-rooted, these ongoing frustrations among the population, particularly younger generations, when constitutional rights and processes exist on paper but are not followed in practice. Perhaps it's not surprising that that leads to increased frustration, which ultimately expresses itself in violence. That sense of powerlessness when communities see the land of their ancestors that they've worked for generations giving over to mining or to monocropping, and especially for indigenous communities for whom the land has important religious or spiritual significance. And you can understand as well why a sense of desperation leads to the lure of the quick buck that can come from coca production, in the country now sadly producing more cocaine than it did in the 1990s. A very serious challenge for all of us there. And the country, it's part of moving into the ranks of developed countries, but yet you have massive inequalities. You have lively downtown Bogota, all built up, and then you have the Choco region, one of the poorest in the world, let alone in Latin America. That tension becomes palpable, but where there's risk, there can also be reward, and that's why there's a need for action and support for all sides of the dispute. So I would support the proposals that have been put forward by CAFOD and AB Colombia and others, that the UK should be looking to activate the democratic clause in the UK Andean Free Trade Agreement, that it should be pushing for civil society participation in the implementation of the peace accord, the points about police reform that have already been made. This is the opportunity to prove what a soft power superpower is like. This is the opportunity to prove the worth of the merger of DFID and the FCO that so many of us were concerned about. Set up diplomatic efforts, yes, but support crop diversification, support education, tax and regulate multinationals and hold them to account, especially if they are based in the UK or listed on our stock exchanges. Peace is possible and the rewards could be great, but equally, for the scales to tip the other way, the results would be devastating. So, as others have said, the UK has a special responsibility as the UN penholder for Colombia, and it should live up to that responsibility.
Now we move to Ian Lavery, virtual.
Thank you, Mrs Millen. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and can I congratulate my honourable friend and member for Jarrah for bringing this very timely debate to the House today. I want to continue on the theme of the recent abuses committed by the Colombian police against protesters, which are absolutely appalling. Millions of Colombians, mostly young people, came onto the streets during April and May of this year to call for an end to the growing poverty, the state violence, and for a full implementation of the peace agreement. The response from the Colombian police was violence. As has already been said, up to 44 protesters were killed and that's according to human rights organisations. There was also reports of sexual violence and thousands of arbitrary arrests. Now, as young people are beaten and killed and sexually abused on the streets of Colombia, we need the UK government to step up to the plate and send a clear message that such blatant human rights abuses will not be tolerated and will not be accepted. Now, we must immediately review our training programme with the Colombian police and suspend it immediately if it's going to units involved in the repression of peaceful protests. The Colombian government has continually failed to accept responsibility for the violence carried out by the police. Instead, they've tried to hoodwink the international community. Just yesterday, during a session at the UN Security Council, the Colombian Foreign Minister and Vice President, Martha Lucía Ramirez, bizarrely claimed that the killing of protesters are on people infiltrating the marches and committing vandalism. You know, we shouldn't be fooled. We've witnessed how the Colombian police have attacked peaceful protesters over the last few years, not just the last couple of months. And we cannot stay silent in our calls for justice as the Colombian government tried to deflect our attention. I'm hoping that the minister might make representations to the Colombian authorities to ensure that a full investigations for all alleged cases of killings committed by the Colombian police during recent protests. As Millar was in Colombia in 2014, I visited the city of Buenaventura. I was there with a local-based human rights organisation, a church organisation, and I went to a neighbourhood where paramilitaries were using local houses to chop people into pieces while they were still alive. I met the communities, predominantly Afro-Colombian, whose children had to listen to the screams of the victims and who were then organised to remove the paramilitaries from the streets. It was horrifying. It was inspirational in equal measure, I might add. Even though that was 7 years ago, sadly we know the violence against activists and communities continue today. The facts and the figures have been recited by colleagues already on this in this debate. But we really do need to see an immediate implementation of a public policy to dismantle paramilitary successor groups as stipulated in the peace agreement. If there's a true commitment to bringing an end to the killings of human rights defenders, why after 3 years in government do we still not see a plan and action to dismantle these illegal armed groups that have such a deep historic links to the Colombian state? I ask the Minister further if he'll reiterate the commitment of our government to ensure that the full implementation of the peace agreement and explain what steps are taken as the pen holder, as has been described earlier, at the UN Security Council. I also call on the Colombian government to use this last year in office to do everything it can to advance as much of the implementation as it possibly can. I know many of my colleagues will continue to monitor the situation closely. Thank you.
Anna Mukasar-Javed.
Thank you, Mrs Miller. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I will try my best to speak as fast as I can in my thick Scottish accent. And may I congratulate the member for Jarrow or Yarrow, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, sorry, for securing this important debate. We have seen, Chair, poverty increase on a global scale around the world as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. However, in Colombia, the economic suffering which has resulted from the pandemic has proved all too much to bear in a country already existing with pre-existing social and political discontent. Since protests began this year, the demands of the Colombian people have increased beyond economic reform. Protesters have been calling for the dismantling of riot police, the creation of a universal basic income programme and free university tuition. And these demands have grown from increasing inequality, a lack of social mobility, and what many deem as oppression of marginalised groups by police forces and the government. As the member for Jarrow mentioned in her opening remarks, there has been a number of deaths in Colombia. Reportedly, more than 220 social and community leaders were killed in 2020 alone, with the majority claimed to be at the hands of the Colombian state security forces, at least 18 trade unionists, and according to the UN verification mission, a total of 133 human rights defenders were murdered. These deaths have led to the condemnation of the country by rights groups such as Amnesty International, who have stated that Colombia is widely recognised as the most dangerous country in the world for those who defend human rights. Military intelligence has also been found to be spying on human rights defenders, journalists, hardcore magistrates and members of the opposition, and to be in fact selling information to neo-paramilitaries. The response of Colombia's riot police to the ongoing protests exemplify the country's failing to protect and uphold the human rights of its people. The police have responded to protesters with excessive force and violence against overwhelmingly peaceful social protests, which has been confirmed by the UN Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. At least 30 protesters, Chair, have been confirmed to have been killed. Over 100 people have been reported as having disappeared, hundreds have suffered serious injury, and over 800 arbitrary arrests have taken place. And as many members have also spoken about, there has been reports of cases of sexual violence taking place at these protests. It's evident that the Colombian people's cry for the dismantling of the riot police is not unfounded, and comprehensive police reform is urgently needed to prevent future significant violations. We must urge the Colombian government to take urgent measures to protect the human rights of the citizens and initiate a comprehensive police and security reform effort to ensure that officers respect the right of peaceful assembly and bring those responsible for abuse to justice. In the midst of the horror and unrest taking place in Colombia, it was heartwarming to note that members of Edinburgh and Glasgow's growing Colombian community have taken to the streets of Scotland in solidarity with those in Colombia. This act of international solidarity is representative of the people of Scotland, the Scottish Government and the Scottish National Party's care and commitment to social justice around the world. Just over 4 minutes.
There we go.
And now we move virtually to Ian Byrne.
Thank you, Chair. It's an honour to share under your chairship. I refer members to my interests in the register of members' financial interests. I would also like to thank my honourable friend, the member for Jarrow, for securing this important debate and for a powerful contribution. I would also like to thank the constituents in Liverpool West Derby who have been in touch with me regularly and have asked me to raise their concerns about human rights violations in Colombia directly with the Minister. I previously raised my concerns in this House on the 20th of April, both about the alleged involvement of Colombian security forces in the deaths of at least 13 protesters last year, and about worrying reports of an increased number of protesters losing their sight after being hit with projectiles fired by police, including 19-year-old Yuri Camargo and 22-year-old Miguel Angel Linares, both in 2019. I asked if the Secretary of State would raise the importance of full legal and disciplinary investigations of those cases with their Colombian counterparts, and no firm commitment was given in the Minister's response. So can I ask today if he can confirm whether these cases have been raised and to update on their progress? Since late April, the situation has become worse. There has been a violent police response to the mass protest organised to reject the proposed tax reform, and in response to longer-running demands around growing poverty, murder of social activists, and a failed implementation of the peace agreement. Between the 28th of April and the 26th of June, Colombian human rights NGO Temblores has registered 4,687 cases of police violence, 73 killings, with at least 44 apparently carried out by the police, over 2,000 arbitrary arrests, 82 victims of eye injuries, principally caused by police projectiles, and 28 victims of sexual assault. There has been international condemnation of the Colombian government response to the mass mobilisation and protests. The UN has condemned the use of excessive force, and the EU has called for the disproportionate use of force by the security forces to stop. So will the Minister today join these calls and issue a full condemnation of the violence of the Colombian police and of the government's comments undermining the rights to protest? Minister, I visited Colombia with JFC in 2018 and I met some of the most inspiring people I have ever met. Trade unionists, mainly mothers, who are putting their lives in danger every single day to fight for a more equal society. The sight of them getting into vehicles with armed guards is something that won't leave me when I think back. I left with the impression of a beautiful country and a proud nation who had seen a glimpse of a chance of peace, but distrust if the government would honour their side of the agreement. The last 3 years have proved them heartbreakingly correct, but overwhelmingly, all parties in 2018 said that we need international pressure to eventually achieve the peace they all seeked. So will the Minister work with his Colombian counterparts to bring about the implementation of the 2016 peace agreement, that gives hope and a real chance to ending the human rights violations that are taking place now? Thank you.
Now we move virtually to Bell Ribeiro Addy.
Thank you, Mrs. Milner. Pleasure to serve under your chairship. I also want to congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Jarrett, for securing this important debate, particularly because recently I spoke to students at St Gabriel's College, where I'm proud to be a governor in Camberwell. Now, South London, where my constituency of Streatham is home to, I believe, one of the largest Colombian communities in the UK, and many would have attended the solidarity protests we saw recently in London. Now, I'm so proud of the students and their lobby, and I want them to know that as young as they are, they have power as citizens, and that their words can make it directly to Parliament, so I'll use mostly their words today. Gabriel explained to me how Colombians feel the government is not listening to them, and the sheer force and unity of the protest that was recently organised by the country's largest trade union and joined by teachers, university students, trade unions, Afro-Colombians and indigenous groups. A united demand to withdraw the proposal which originally levelled sales tax on public services and some food, and how years of inequality and injustice combined with COVID lockdowns with no support had thrown even more people out of work and left many Colombians destitute. Juan Palo, who was born in Cali at the epicenter of the violence, he explained that it is important, how important the place is for the whole country in terms of agriculture, and why Parco Nacional started and the government were using it to make food more expensive. They've done their research, and Juan explained about the UK's policing and how it had been training Colombian police over the past years. They questioned how the UK, some of their countries had come to flee human rights abuses, could be so openly complicit in the human rights abuses committed in Colombia. Yere, Sarah and Alexia, some of the youngest in the group, 11, 12, 13, along with Manuel, spoke particularly about how worried they were about family members in Colombia. It was students at St Gabriel's College are particularly affected. Many have had their family members shot, injured, and even some missing, with one young man's father missing since March. Lucas, Manuel and Alejandro spoke to me about human rights abuses and inequality and the widespread police brutality, sexual assault and murders. They were particularly concerned about the ongoing violence against the LGBT community and said that even though Colombia on paper appears to have the strong rights for LGBT people, and that it wasn't practiced in terms of what actually happens there. Now, women in particular are disadvantaged with infant mortality, 12 in every 1,000 babies dying before their first birthday, and almost 39% of the largely Afro-Colombian part of the country living in extreme poverty. Valentina was particularly concerned not just about the mental health of Colombians there, but the mental health of Colombians in the UK who are watching their family go through many of these things and were helpless to change it. Elisa and all of them actually spoke with pride about Colombia and how they felt about the country where some of them were born and some of their parents were born. And some, like Santiago, however, spoke of how he saw people their age in Colombia who didn't have the same opportunities that he now had because of the economic situation and because of how exacerbated the violence had been. Colombians in the UK are calling on the UK government to promote reform of the Colombian security services and full implementation of the peace accord, and to review the UK's training of the Colombian police and suspend the selling of riot control equipment and arms export to Colombia. I think that's a simple demand. And to end without paraphrasing directly in the words of Nicholas, he said, as young Colombians in the UK, we are asking the UK government not to forget Colombia, to open their eyes to the violence and injustice, and last but not least, to remember that the United Kingdom acts as the penholder for the Colombian peace process and live up to what it has promised. So I ask the Minister to please live up to what the UK has promised on behalf of those young students that lobbied me so well earlier this year. Thank you.
Thank you. And we're having one or two technical challenges this afternoon with some connections. So I think we'll just press pause on Claudia's contribution and move on to Mary.
You can't see me?
We can't see you. Can I just ask the advice of the chair? Yeah, I mean, if you're happy to go, right, Claudia, you're back on again. If you're happy to proceed, we can hear you clearly and now we can see you. So, are you happy to proceed that way? Oh,
yes.
Okay,
thank you.
We can hear you very clearly. Go ahead.
You can hear me, that's
Yeah.
great. I've had to obviously switch devices. We've had a bit of a problem, but thank you, Mrs. Miller, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. I also congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Jarrah, for securing this hugely important debate. We know that since April, Colombia has been experiencing huge popular citizen mobilisation against unfair tax reform, against poverty, corruption, murder of social justice activists, and a failed implementation of the 2016 peace agreements. These mass protests have included, of course, a widespread of people from young people from poor urban neighbourhoods and other marginalised groups, and of course, the organisation of civil society through the National Strike Committee. These demonstrations have been met with unacceptable state violence. We know that according to Colombia's Foundation for Press Liberty, there were 257 cases of aggression towards journalists covering protests, with the majority committed by state agents. Since protests began, we across the world have witnessed through images and videos police shooting live ammunition at crowds, firing gas canisters at people's faces, beating isolated protesters, arbitrary arrests, indiscriminate use of high-grade weaponry, and launching tear gas into enclosed spaces. Several videos have shown people in civilian clothing shooting protesters, often while standing alongside police, including an incident which left 10 indigenous protesters injured. Colombia remains, as others have said, the world's most dangerous country for environmental defenders. In 2019, 64 environmental activists were murdered. Colombia was also confirmed once again as the world's most dangerous for trade unionists, with 22 killed so far in 2021, according to the International Trade Union Confederation. Community activists also continue to face extremely high levels of violence. The attempts by the Colombian government to engage with protesters have been criticised for being so cosmetic, so unsubstantial, and in some cases dishonest. There has been widespread international condemnation of the Colombian government response to the protests, from the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, the EU, the American Embassy and others. It is therefore shameful. Shameful that the UK government has not condemned this unacceptable violence perpetrated by the Colombian police and government. The UK Embassy in Colombia and the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office have said they are saddened by the violence. Yet this neutral, passive language really does very little justice to the suffering of the Colombian people at the hands of their own government. I urge the Minister to rectify this and to unequivocally condemn the Colombian state for its deadly and violent treatment of peaceful protesters. I also encourage the Foreign Secretary to call on the Colombian government to properly engage with the proposals of the National Strike Committee. It is also essential that the UK uses its diplomatic strength to encourage the Colombian government to uphold the 2016 peace agreement. It is vital that the UK government immediately reviews any aid or training support to the Colombian police and suspend any element linked to human rights abuses. We must immediately cease the sale of weapons, including water cannons, tear gas and baton, which could be used against protesters in Colombia. Just as it was morally reprehensible for the UK and other countries to export riot equipment to America that was used against Black Lives Matter protesters following the murder of George Floyd, it is wrong for peaceful Colombian protesters to be brutalised by equipment sold from Britain. Ultimately, the UK must use its diplomatic might to protect Colombian protesters who are exercising their democratic rights and making their voices heard. Thank you, Mrs. Miller.
Thank you. I'm just before I move on to virtually to Mary Kelly Foy, could I just point out we've got 3 more speakers before the front bench speeches start at 4:13. So could I suggest maybe 3 minutes each so everybody can get in. Mary Kelly Foy.
Thank you, Chair, and glad to serve under your chairmanship, and I'm grateful to the Honourable Member for Jarrow for securing this important debate. The right to protest is a fundamental one that must always be respected. It's therefore extremely alarming that Colombian security forces continue to use lethal force against unarmed protesters. While we've witnessed widespread human rights violations since April this year, violent repression of public protest has been a constant theme under the government of Ivan Duque. Security forces have regularly attacked and killed protesters, but there's been little visible attempt to curtail their actions, and most abuses remain in impunity. Before its report last week found disproportionate use of force by the public security forces, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights warned in 2019 that the use of force must be guided by legality, strict necessity and proportionality. Yet, just 4 days later, Esmed riot police killed 16-year-old Dylan Cruz as he ran from their attacks. It's so worrying that the Colombian government has already said it will not implement the latest recommendations from the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights on how to improve the policing of protests. Can the Minister say what assessment the British government has made of that report and its assessment of the disproportionate force during the recent protests? In September last year, police killed up to 13 unarmed people during protests following the killing of a man in police custody. Shortly afterwards, the Colombian Supreme Court referenced these killings and others when it was declared that the Esmed riot police systematically violates citizens' democratic right to peaceful protest, due process and freedom of expression. The army has also been responsible for the deaths of unarmed civilians in protests. In March 2020, 20-year-old peasant farmer Alejandro Carvajal was killed during protests over the army forcibly removing cocoa crops in operations which appear to contravene the 2016 peace agreement's prioritisation of mutually agreed substitution. Several other peasant farmers have been killed in recent years while protesting against military operations in their communities. In 2019, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights called on the Colombian state to stop using the military in situations of public protest, while recommending an in-depth transformation of the Esmed Riot Police and independent investigations into its conduct towards public protest. Sadly, these recommendations are far from being met. Instead, Colombia's Inspector General recently opened investigations against opposition Congress members over their attempts to protect citizens from police violence after they had criticised the Duque government's response to the protest. Last year, Transparency International warned of a concentration of power across Colombian institutions, which was blurring the separation of powers and threatening the democratic process. Can the Minister say what the British government will do to promote greater respect for the rights of people to protest in Colombia? And finally, I want to express my concern for the continuing targeting of trade unionists and environmental defenders. Historically, Colombia has been the most dangerous country in the world for trade unionists, with 3,200 killed since the 1970s. Since the peace deal was signed, 35 members of the Agricultural Workers Union, FENSUAGO, have been killed. We must start to see justice for these crimes. Rather than seeking to crush protests, silence the demands around the issues of human rights and peace, and target critical politicians, the Colombian government should be respecting its citizens' rights to mobilise and protest peacefully. Thank you.
Jim Shannon.
Chair, thank you very much, and can I first of all congratulate the Honourable Lady for Jarrow on setting the scene and giving us all a chance to participate in this debate. Recent protests have brought international attention once again on the human rights situation in Colombia. We know there is a considerable concern internationally about the response of the police towards the protesters, and reports of several protesters being killed. The actions of the Red Police are particularly alarming, and I want to put that on record. And Madam Chair, I also want to send my condolences to all the victims and their families, and hope that there will be a full and exhaustive investigation, that those responsible will be made accountable, because that's what I wish to see. My right honourable colleague, the member for Lagan Valley, has a particular interest in Colombia, and so have I, and I've had it for many, many years. I've had a number of invitations to go to Colombia, but never had the chance due to other commitments, but I hope someday I will get the opportunity to get there. After a visit to Colombia, the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights, the official organ of the Organisation of American States, said that the Colombian police had used disproportionate force, that there was gender-based violence, racial violence, reports of people being disappeared. There's also concerns expressed about the use of the military during the protests. I want to ask a couple of questions, if I can, Madam Chair. One of their recommendations was to echo the demands of the Colombian human rights organisations to move the jurisdiction of the police away from the Minister of Defence into a civilian department such as the Interior Ministry. So can I ask the Minister again, if it's possible, could that be pursued? I believe this is surely a necessary step in line with the context of the ongoing peace process. Secondly, I also want to speak about the situation for human rights defenders in Colombia. I want to congratulate the great work that they've been doing to defend human rights. Is a sense that they are not having to put their lives at risk to carry out their work. And according to Colombian organisations Somos Defensores, 2020 was the most dangerous year to be a human rights defender in Colombia for more than a decade, with 189 people murdered. According to the organisation, in the past, over 300 social activists were killed. So I asked the Minister this question: what can this government, my government, do to ensure human rights defenders are more protected in Colombia? I also would ask the Minister, I believe we must not drop our focus and commitment to supporting internationally to make sure the Colombian peace process, agreement is fully implemented. And fourthly, the recent advances in the transitional justice system are welcome and must be supported, as have been the reports of almost 50% of former FARC combatants who have been able to initiate economic projects. But I believe it is concerning that so many former FARC combatants are still waiting to initiate projects, and I would ask what has been done to help them. And I understand that there needs to be rapid action to ensure that they access land to accelerate the process. I've always been supportive of the making land available, so let's make sure that happens. Equally, the distribution of land to small-scale farmers, as stipulated in the agreement, has unfortunately so far not advanced fast enough. All advances in the peace process will benefit the work to improve the human rights situation, and conversely, all the work focused on improving the human rights situation and tackling the illegal armed groups that still exist will massively assist efforts to implement the peace agreement. Coming as I do from Northern Ireland, Madam Chair, I say this: if anyone knows how important the peace talks are, then can I say that we in Northern Ireland are. I would urge the Minister to grasp that opportunity for peace on behalf of those in Colombia. I want to say that sincerely. I hope we can do something for them. Madam Chair, thank you so much. Yeah.
And the last 3 minutes before we go to front bench speeches goes to John McDonnell, virtually.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be extremely brief. I'm the Secretary of the National Union Journalists Parliamentary Group, so I want to raise again, as I have in previous debates around Colombia, the plight of journalists, the abuse of their human rights and the violations of press freedom. The International Federation of Journalists have just recently published another report which has highlighted the targeting of journalists by the Colombian authorities, and in particular, the killings, of course, the physical attacks, the obstruction of the work of journalists, and in addition to that, the undermining of the basic press freedoms that they have. And this is coming from the national police, and it's coming from public officials, and also reactionary elements associated with the current government. I want to leave the debate with at least some of the words of practitioners in the field in Colombia. Adriana Hurtado is the president of the Colombian Federation of Journalists. Let me quote her directly and briefly. She says, "There is an evident regression in the causes of violence against journalists. They are spied upon in the traditional way. They are harassed on social media. Politicians stigmatize them through messages through social media, accusing journalists of spreading misinformation, damaging democracy and polarizing society. Aggression has increased again against journalists. Threats, physical attacks, killings, smear campaigns, legal actions aimed at censoring their work, illegal espionage against journalists, and also many journalists forced into exile. There's a lack of labour protection for journalists. As a result of the pandemic in particular, they're in a particularly weak economic situation as well. But their main concern is just the loss of the rule of law, the government acting with impunity, and the slowness of justice when investigating crimes against journalists. So I repeat what others have said. We need an extremely strong statement from the government now, which is linked up with our European and other international partners condemning the human rights abuses of this Colombian government. And I would like inserted in those condemnations the demand for a free press, the protection of journalists, which is essential for any democratic society. Can I also say this as well? What we've not had in the past in this country is the use of other powers. So I would like the government now to start mentioning to the Colombian government officials that actually we now have the Magnitsky clause, and if necessary, we will use that to target human rights abusers through our own legislative system. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. We now move to front bench speeches. If I could ask everybody to do about 10 minutes to allow the proposer of the motion a couple of minutes to wind up. Alan Smith.
Thank you, Mrs Miller. I always make my speeches short. I'm always struck that nobody ever criticised a speech by being too brief. So I try to always be succinct. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. It's also a pleasure to wind up for the SNP in what I thought was a very constructive and consensual debate. And I would congratulate the Honourable Member Jarrow for bringing this forward and her own contribution, but also on the timing of this debate. It's a very opportune moment for us to be considering a situation in Colombia. I'm struck as well, of course, by contributions from friends from Glasgow North and from Adrian Shotts. My friend from Glasgow North stressed what I think is at stake in this, if we get this right, the sustainable development potential for Colombia to be a world leader in all sorts of positive societal changes. But he also noted, of course, that cocoa production is now greater than it was in the 1990s. That has immediate consequences domestically within Colombia, but also for us here and the wider world. And my friend from Adrian Shotts stressed very correctly how dangerous Colombia is for journalists and activists and the deterioration within their lives in recent months and years. And the SNP stands foursquare with the people of Colombia. We are not pro-government or pro-protester. We want to see a durable peace for everybody. And we acknowledge that we do not have all the answers from this part of the world. But it is an important moment, and we need to recognise that the already fragile peace process has been almost overwhelmed by COVID. COVID, of course, bringing concomitant disasters in health and economic consequences, exacerbating an already very fragile domestic situation. Now, we are glad that to my mind, rather cack-handed tax reform proposals, which were the trigger for the recent protests, have been shelved for the moment. But we also acknowledge that there remains a financial crisis within Colombian public finances that does risk chaos and further deteriorations. So where we acknowledge the problems facing the Colombian government, we do very firmly state that the response of the Colombian government to the protests must be condemned, and the right to protest must be defended. And that's a crucial point to make, because the figures are very, very stark. In 2020 alone, as we've heard, 220 community and social leaders have been killed, 22 trade unionists have been killed also, and according to the UN verification mission, at least 133 human rights defenders have been killed. Thousands more are currently in jail or suffering harassment. And the UK is in a position to do more on this. As we've heard, the UK is the penholder in the UN on the Colombian peace process, and there are more things that we can do. So I hope today we can make some concrete suggestions to spur more activity. So a number of concrete suggestions, and I have much respect for our Minister, and I do hope she engages in the constructive nature of this debate. I think there are a lot of good ideas from all points of the political compass in the House. Firstly, in terms of the macroeconomic crisis that Colombia is suffering, if not direct assistance, what capacity do we have to offer advice to stabilise the current economic crisis and to help them through that process? Also, in terms of support in dealing with the COVID disaster that we are all suffering, but perhaps we can assist with theirs. We've heard concerns about the training of the security services and the policing of public order. What consideration have we given to whether that has been misused or abused? And in terms of Magnitsky sanctions, we really should have called it something easier, but the Magnitsky sanctions, what consideration has been given to targeting individuals within the Colombian regime or elsewhere who have acted poorly? We would also like to see greater financial and practical assistance for human rights defender organisations. We think they are doing a power of work and need more support. We'd also want to see more facilitation of dialogue with the FARC and pressure to implement the 2016 peace agreement more actively on the part of the government. And of course, there's more than one party to that discussion, but the UK could play a greater role. So to close, Mrs Miller, there is no easy answers or quick fixes to Colombia's problems. But as my friend from Glasgow North said, this is a test for the UK's new and, we're told, improved merged foreign and development policy at a crucial time for Colombia, at a crucial time for a number of other partners in the region as well. The progress made in 2016 could be lost, and that would be a disaster not just for the people of Colombia, but elsewhere. So if the Minister and Government are serious about protecting it, there's been a number of constructive suggestions this afternoon, and if she's serious about taking those forward, she will continue to have SNP support. Thank you, Mrs Miller.
Fabian Hamilton.
Thank you very much indeed, Mrs Miller, and I'd like to congratulate my colleague, my honourable friend, the member for Jarrow, for bringing this debate to Parliament today. She, in a very powerful opening speech, told us that the peace agreement in Colombia was not working. I'm sure every member present today would certainly agree with that. She also said that recent events had been condemned across the world, and that's absolutely true. Every day I receive emails, messages from other countries, from other activists saying that the peace agreement is not working and that the violence must be condemned. And she made a very important point, that this government, the government of our country, cannot support trade deals with Colombia without condemning the appalling violence that we've all seen on our television screens. The police response, she said, was as if there was a war between the police and their own population, the human rights activists, the people demonstrating against the breakdown of the peace deal and the murder and the violence. I thought it was a very powerful opening speech, and I thank her for this debate. My close friend, who's not at his place at the moment, the member for Hemsworth, then continued with his contribution, talking about the prolonged crisis in Colombia, the economy in free fall, the government wanting to raise taxes from the poorest members of the population. He gave us a startling statistic. The richest 10% of Colombians own 40% of the economy. That is quite extraordinary. And that citizen activity was seen by the state as a threat to the government. The Colombian criminal justice system, which should be there to defend those who are innocent, is actually used as a weapon against the demonstrators. We then heard from my Right Honourable friend, the member for Rochdale, with whom I work closely on Colombian issues. And he said that demonstrations had been peaceful, yet the Defence Minister was calling them dangerous, that there are massive levels of violence by the Colombian police against their own population, that 278 members of the FARC had been murdered since the peace accord was signed. That's a startling figure, and yet still the FARC are committed to that peace accord. We then heard from the Honourable Member for Glasgow North in a powerful contribution that the spokesperson for the SNP mentioned several times. He visited in 2018 and he mentioned that tax rises were one of the factors leading to street demonstrations. And then my honourable friend, the member for Wansbeck, talked about the Colombian government repeatedly failing to condemn police violence. That he said we must dismantle or ensure that the paramilitaries were dismantled immediately. He's absolutely right about that. And then we heard from the honourable member, new member of this House, from Adrian Schatz, in a powerful contribution, talking about increasing inequality in Colombia. 220 social and community leaders killed in 2020, 133 human rights defenders killed, statistics that any government or nation should be deeply ashamed of. My colleague from Liverpool West Derby talked about individual cases which he raised and wanted the Minister to respond to. He reeled off some horrifying facts about the assault and killings of those individuals and asked whether the Minister will condemn that violence, and I'll obviously let her speak for herself shortly. My colleague, the member for Streatham, my honourable friend for Streatham, talked about her experience with young Colombians living in her constituency, speaking out about the police brutality and the assaults on women and LGBT activists, and the effect that this had on the mental health not only of those who were the victims and their families, but people who are living here safely in the United Kingdom, something we often forget. We then heard Mrs Miller from the Honourable Member for Leicester East, who talked about the failure of the implementation of the 2016 peace agreement, the unacceptable state violence. This is a theme that has gone through today's debate, the unacceptable state violence, and of course the aggression towards journalists. She talked about gas canisters being fired at people's faces. Can you imagine that, Mrs Miller? Horrifying, absolutely horrifying. And then my honourable friend, the member for the City of Durham, talked about the right to protest being a human right, a basic human right. And she mentioned the role of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and their guidelines that are clearly being breached. And then from one of my old friends, the honourable member from Strangford for Strangford, who I think in his typically generous fashion sent his condolences to all the victims of violence in Colombia and their families, and asked pertinently, what can the United Kingdom government do to help defend human rights in Colombia? And then finally, from the backbenches, although previously one of our most senior members of the front bench, the honourable member for Hayes and Harlington, who we know has had a long record of protecting, defending journalists all over the world, a very proud record. And he talked about, again, the targeting of journalists, the undermining of press freedom. A basic tenet of democracy is press freedom, and yet the politicians and leaders of the current government in Colombia are stigmatising journalists, are undermining that press freedom that is so important to guaranteeing our democracy. Mrs Miller, the violence that we've seen across Colombia over the last few months has run completely out of control. The country's police and security forces have used unnecessary violence to contain widespread protests, which has put the historic 2016 peace agreement at severe risk. Between the 28th of April and the end of June, at least 73 civilians, including many trade unionists, human rights activists and indigenous people, have been killed in the protests, with hundreds more injured. Colombian human rights NGO Temblores say that 44 of these killings were allegedly carried out by the police. Extremely disturbing, and many honourable and right honourable members have mentioned that this afternoon. And alongside the killings, Temblores registered 4,687 cases of police violence, 2,005 arbitrary arrests, 82 victims of eye injuries, principally caused by police projectiles. Since the protests began, videos posted to social media have shown police shooting live ammunition at crowds, firing gas canisters into people's faces, as we've heard, beating isolated protesters, arbitrary arrests, indiscriminate use of high-grade weaponry, and launching tear gas into enclosed spaces. This behaviour, we'd all agree, is entirely and completely unacceptable, and we have to be clear that these protests were largely peaceful, but cracked down on against by violence by the Colombian police and security forces. So far, all the British government has done is to sign a trade deal with Colombia, where both parties guaranteed to respect democracy and human rights. Despite this, 2 years on from signing the deal, it's very worrying indeed that the UK government has not directly criticised the violence committed by the Colombian police. So I would urge the Minister to take this chance to condemn it fully today, to not embrace our role as the pen holder, and to not use our considerable influence could lead to further violence and a further needless loss of life in Colombia. So I therefore urge the Minister, alongside condemning the violence this afternoon, to commit to beginning a review into any training support given to the Colombian police, to call on the Colombian government to ensure full disciplinary and legal investigations against all perpetrators of violence, particularly considering lack of advancement in cases from 2019 to 2020. And of course, 2020 was the bloodiest year on record since the peace agreement was signed. I'd also urge her to call on the Colombian government to listen to the proposals set out by the National Strike Committee. And finally, Mrs. Miller, to tell us what representations she or the United Kingdom government has made, if any, to the Colombian ambassador to London and her counterparts in the Colombian government itself, particularly with regard to increasing its efforts, the Colombian government's efforts, to actually implement the 2016 peace agreement.
Minister.
Thank you, Mrs. Miller, and it's a pleasure to serve on this debate with you in the chair. Let me start by saying that I'm very grateful to the Honourable Member for Jarrow for securing this debate this afternoon. Peace and human rights in Colombia is an issue that I know means a great deal to her, and it does to me. And I can see that from the debate today and from the correspondence that I receive as a minister, it means a great deal to members from right across the House. And I'm grateful for the contributions of all members today, and I will do my best to respond to as many of the points as I can. Let me start by saying, though, that the UK is a key supporter of Colombia's historic 2016 peace agreement, and we are proud to lead on the issue at the United Nations Security Council. Colombia is also a human rights priority country for this government and an important partner to the UK in Latin America. And members can read our assessment of the current state of human rights in Colombia in the annual Human Rights Report that was published by the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office just last week on the 8th of July. This debate, though, is set against a backdrop of worrying protests which we have seen spread across Colombia. Starting on the 28th of April, Mrs. Miller, a national strike accompanied by widespread demonstrations was carried out with the support of a broad range of civil society actors. The strike was mostly characterised by peaceful protests, with demands revolving around a range of issues. However, the protests also led to violent clashes between the public security forces and protesters, and the deliberate destruction of public infrastructure, lengthy road blockades, and alleged abuses by public security forces. From the 28th of April to the 16th of June, the office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights registered allegations of 56 deaths, including 54 civilians and 2 police officers, in the context of the protests, and hundreds were injured. The British government understands the deep concern that exists about the reports of human rights violations in relation to the protests. And we engage with the Colombian government at an early stage in the protests to raise our concerns. On the 14th of May, I spoke with the then acting Foreign Minister, Adriana Mejia, to express our concerns and to welcome Colombia's commitment to transparent investigations into allegations of excessive use of force by the police. And on Monday of this week, I spoke to the Colombian ambassador to the UK for an update on investigations. I was pleased to learn that over 200 investigations into alleged misconduct by police are now open. And we have made clear that we look to the Colombian authorities to fully investigate any reports of excessive use of force and to take appropriate action against those responsible. We firmly support the right of all Colombians to protest peacefully, and the Colombian government knows that we look to them to guarantee respect for the rights to peaceful assembly and association. And I reiterated this message publicly on the 6th of May, and in doing so mirrored the messaging from our embassy in Bogotá on the 4th, the 5th and the 7th of May. I know some honourable members have asked about police training, and I want to say that the UK's engagement goes beyond ministerial and official discussions. We work closely with the UN Verification Mission and the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Colombia, as well as the wider international community, in support of their efforts to reduce tensions and to promote dialogue. We are firmly committed to our programmes to help implement the peace agreement, to support peace, stability and security, and to build a more prosperous Colombian society. President Duque's promise of police reform, including increased oversight of officers, is an important step in response to the protests. One of our programmes supports the modernisation of the Colombian National Police and is being implemented through the International Organisation of Migration with strategic support and advice from Police Scotland. Like all our training of overseas law enforcement officers, the project is supported by the Cross-Governmental International Policing Assistance Board and the Overseas Security and Justice Assistance Assessment. This is to gauge and mitigate any human rights risks that arise from providing training to specific forces. We are not aware of any police units in Colombia that have received UK training support being involved in human rights violations. But one of our top priorities for Colombia is to support the government to implement the 2016 peace accords. And since 2015, the UK has spent over £63 million in support of peace, stability and security in Colombia. We lead on the issue, as members have highlighted today, at the UN Security Council, and we are the largest donor to the UN Trust Fund supporting the implementation of the peace agreement. And we recognise the important progress that has been achieved so far. Security conditions in much of the country are considerably better than over the past 5 years, and strides have been made towards reintegration of former combatants. Our work at the United Nations as penholder on Colombia's peace process in New York is making a real difference. In May, the Security Council unanimously adopted a UK-drafted resolution to expand the mandate of the UN Verification Mission in Colombia. And this is a significant step, tasking the mission with verifying compliance with the transitional justice sentences of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace. I know this, on the specific point of transitional justice, which was raised by the member for Jarrow and others in her speech today, her opening remarks today. Let me say that the UK has always supported the vital work of the transitional justice elements of the peace accords, and we are extremely pleased that those institutions have been able to continue their work despite the challenges posed by COVID-19. The UK government has contributed over £26 million towards transitional justice mechanisms and victims of the conflict in Colombia since 2016, and this includes supporting the Truth Commission's work to gather testimony from Colombians both in Colombia and abroad, including here in the UK, as well as working to enhance the investigatory capacity of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace Colombia's post-conflict special court. The transitional justice institutions established by the peace agreement are reaching a critical phase now, Mrs Miller, in their work, with the special jurisdiction for peace due to hand down its first sentences and the Truth Commission to issue its final report later this year. Colleagues and members today have also raised the issues of human rights defenders, so let me just say a few words on that. Because all this said, and despite the fantastic progress that has been made, the situation does remain challenging and fragile. Colombia is in the grip of a prolonged third wave of COVID-19. During 2020, Colombia saw a 6.8 percentage point increase in poverty levels and 7.4 million people, which is 15% of the population, are now living in extreme poverty. The continued presence of illegal armed groups in Colombia and the impact that their violence and imitation have on a vulnerable population is a serious concern. In 2020, the UN confirmed that 133 human rights defenders were killed. Since the signing of the peace deal with FARC in 2016, over 275 community leaders and former FARC members were killed. The UK has funded programmes to help Colombia tackle the conditions that make people susceptible to recruitment by armed groups and that foster the persistent level of violence towards human rights defenders, social leaders, just one moment, former FARC, EP combatants, trade unionists and others.
Yes. Thank the Minister for giving way, and I'm not going to delay too long. Just I had asked in my contribution about the transfer of land, because I believe if we're doing the real bread and butter issues with the land to the people who should be getting it through the agreement and the peace accord, then that would also help to take away some of the sting that we have there. Thank you.
Minister. I think the honourable gentleman raised an important point, and I was just about to come on to the issue of sustainable recovery and the issue of trade and economic opportunities, which I think is important. But in terms of raising our concerns, I can assure members that we also regularly raise specific concerns, cases of concern with the Colombian authorities. In February, the UK's Ambassador for Human Rights, Rita French, conducted a virtual visit in Colombia to discuss human rights issues. This followed on from Lord Ahmed's human rights-focused virtual visit to Colombia in October of 2020. As Colombia begins its recovery, though now, from the coronavirus pandemic, the UK is committed to supporting the promotion of sustainable economic opportunities that will help to tackle some of the root causes of the ongoing violence. Our international climate finance commitments play a vital role in addressing this challenge. Since 2011, we have provided over £237 million in Colombia to help halt deforestation, improve land use and create profitable, sustainable supply chains that protect the environment. Last year, we announced a £64 million programme to support the Colombian government in reducing deforestation, specifically in conflict-affected areas. And I'm pleased to say that this year will also mark the second anniversary of the signing of the UK-Colombia Partnership for Sustainable Growth. And as we look forward to COP26 later this year, the partnership is a concrete example of how a bilateral commitment for nature and sustainable growth can actually foster climate ambition globally. But let me assure members of our continued commitment to prioritise human rights in our relationship with Colombia, and by thanking colleagues from across the House today for your interest, for your concern and activism, for sharing your many thoughts and many ideas with me as well today. We do welcome your perspectives, all of which do help us to build a productive dialogue with the Colombian authorities and civil society groups to address the ongoing challenges in the implementation of the peace accord and to show up the gains made since 2016.
Kate Osborne to wind up.
Thank you, Mrs Miller. Can I thank all honourable and right honourable members for all the powerful contributions today, and also like to take the opportunity to thank Justice for Colombia and Grow Colombia for everything that they do to help bring peace to the Colombian people. Anyone that has been to Colombia, and I know that there are a lot of us here today that have had the opportunity on one or more occasion to visit, will know that it's truly a beautiful country with warm and welcoming people. So it's an absolute tragedy that it has been and continues to be the site of so much violence. It's a tragedy that all those who stand up to ask for an end to the huge disparity of wealth, for an end to the human rights abuses, for justice for crimes committed against their loved ones, for the protection of the environment, for their right to remain on ancestral lands, for the right to live in peace, that all those who stand up to ask for these things have to risk their lives to do so. But there is hope. There is hope still in the peace process and the advances that have already been made. There is hope in seeing so many people in Colombia continue to stand up in the belief that they can build a better future in spite of all these risks. So we must continue to do all we can as MPs and as a government to support everyone in Colombia working to improve the human rights situation and working to make peace a reality for all. Thank you.